Hello, welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at understanding persuasion and looking at persuasive writing, the skills of persuasion, and basically the methods of persuasion and how it is used through various text types. So we're going to look at not only persuasion in terms of how you can write and how you can use it, but also the various types of it, because aside from what you may have covered previously, there are a number of different types of persuasion. There's not just the opinionated and argumentative type. There are a number of different methods of which persuasion can be used. There's a number of different ways of being able to discuss it and being able to measure it. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. So to start with, persuasion is more than just trying to convince a reader or something. Or even if it's the case of a film, then it's trying to provoke a message. This is the same thing, an audience. I mean, persuasion is a way of communicating a message in such a way that you're trying to affect the action or affect the behavior of a viewer, an audience member, a reader, all those things. So by basically getting them to put their hand up to get them to support what it is that you are, your point of view and what ideas that you're saying and what you're trying to provoke. And it's the same with any other maker of any kind of text or media, is that they'll try and basically get people on side with their work, to get support for their work, or for their ideas, or for their point of view. And the reason for that is obviously, first of all, they want people to support them so they can do things their way, but also because of the basically the power of persuasion and the power of basically being able to convince people to commit to an idea that you've started. And that's where persuasion comes in and is quite a significant tool. Okay. Now, it's also about how facts and ideas are represented and arranged in order to construct an argument. And the argument is a huge part of it. And persuasion is pretty much covers a huge amount of text, and essentially what every text tries to do to a certain extent is persuade, as much as it does to entertain in many cases, but persuade people to sort of take on a point of view, whether it's to take, I guess, the message of, whether it be through morals, through a particular message from a story. It could be through simply engaging and taking on board some of the ideas that it sort of provokes and those sorts of things. All of that is part of persuasion, and it's about basically understanding how ideas are basically represented to make you feel connected to them, and in order to persuade you to feel a certain way about them. That's ultimately what persuasion is doing, is trying to get you to feel a certain way about something. And it's more than just simply doing it in the form of an argument. It's about just how the facts are arranged in order to make you feel that way. Alright, so first thing, what is persuasion? Okay, well, I'm going to look at it from the two points I just mentioned then, which were representation, which is basically how you can arrange and represent ideas in order to convey your point of view, and through argument, where it's basically can be delivered through a number of methods, and it's not always a clear bias. So what I mean there, by both of those things, is representation is the form and the type of language and the type of images and basically the presentation of ideas, how this argument is being represented in order to get you on board with it. So as the reader, as someone who is responding and interacting with a message, you are essentially working out how all those things put together are making you feel something. The argument is the message itself, as in what ideas are being put forward to you, how are they being put forward to you, and what are they making you do? What sort of imperatives are making you respond to those sorts of things? So, and as I said, it's not just simply about a clear bias either. There are a number of different ways in which an author can do it, and we'll go through those in a moment as well. But essentially, persuasion involves these two things. That it's a representation of an argument, or one that essentially tries to get you on side with whatever point of view that the author or the composer is trying to make. Alright, so how can it be used? Now, persuasion can be used for a number of things. Now, the most obvious one, I suppose, and the one you'll probably be most familiar with, at least in terms of your writing, will be using it to express an opinion. Now, to express an opinion is only really a small part of what you can actually do with persuasion. You can do a lot of other things with it. And to have an opinion is one thing, but people don't always take opinions that credibly. They don't always immediately support someone. If I was to give you a very outrageous opinion, it would be very unlikely that you would go straight ahead and go, well, that's true, I accept that. And it's the same here with persuasion. There are a number of different ways that persuasion can be used in order to do something. Expressing an opinion is one. To gather support and supporters is another. So to use persuasion to sort of twist the arm and to goad people into saying, okay, yes, we'll back you, we'll support what it is you're doing. And certainly in the case of a lot of civil rights groups, in terms of a lot of charities and essentially goodwill groups, are trying to gather support and supporters. The same as lobby groups, the ones who try and push it towards a certain cause. Again, they'll be trying to use persuasion in order to get people to back them, because it's one thing to have a very powerful message. It's even more when you've got people behind you who are willing to support it. It may be pushing for action or change. So if you see, again, it's more to do with lobbying and I guess through goodwill, and essentially to change the world in a manner which suits a particular individual or a particular group. So to push for action and change is, again, another effective. I mean, all these are not necessarily positive or negative terms. They're just ways that people try and use language, use images, use text in its various forms, whether it be visual or language or otherwise, to get people to support their way of thinking, and to do so in a way where it becomes attractive to them. To sell. Now, speaking of attractive, selling is basically what advertising does, and advertising is entirely persuasive. It's trying to entirely twist your arm into doing something, to doing the action the advertiser wants. So selling is a huge thing, and if you're looking at an ad, then definitely that a lot of persuasive language is used. To work towards a greater good, as in pretty much all these things together, to try and work towards a positive outcome, to try and benefit society, and to convince others of one's view. I mean, that's the most simplest way you can look at it. So it's not just about doing things for the greater good, it can be just simply to put one's point of view forward, and not just express an opinion, but to convince others of your opinion. So it's not simply just saying, well, I believe in this, and there's a reason for it, and there's a reason you should as well. Okay, so it's different, and as we go from express your opinion to convince others of your view, you're really getting to the heart of what persuasion is asking you, or what persuasion does, is it convinces people. And when you're studying it, when you're talking about it, when you're writing about it, that's what you'd be looking for. Okay, so essentially there are a number of different things at work. You look at bias, you look at opinion, you look at facts, and you look at persuasion together. And essentially it's very easy to distinguish a person or a group's opinion as being biased if they are arguing it directly, as in if they put their name to what they say. So if they do that, then yes, it's very easy. However, not all arguments are this way. Some do present facts and do not carry a personal viewpoint, and yet they're equally persuasive. So we're going to look at some examples of that in a moment, but there are some methods of writing persuasively which are very direct, which will say that here I am, this is who I am, and this is what I believe in. And then there are others who have been written by someone completely anonymous and yet are still trying to convince others of that same sort of opinion. They can communicate the same idea in a completely different way and still be persuasive and still get people on board with it. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to categorize them. And we're going to divide them into two types, two categories. Personal, as in the type that basically says that this is coming from me, and fact-driven, which is essentially just stating all the facts as they are and using that narrative, all those construction of facts put together in order to make you respond in the way that the author wants you to. Okay, so the personal one, which is basically an emotional plea from me to you, and the fact-driven, which is giving you all the facts and allowing you to make up your own mind, but to do so in a way which will hopefully support our cause. Now, of course, these things will have elements that overlap with each other, and they're not completely distinct categories. And you'll certainly find some which have a combination of both. But the one thing is you can get these two types of extremes, and it's good to look at these two types of approaches and then see how they sort of join together. All right, so let's look at the two approaches. So personal arguments are, as I said before, from someone's point of view, and it's represented basically directly through their belief and through their emotion, particularly the emotion part. Because a lot of personal arguments are made quite emotionally, as in they've made from personal experience, they're made because they are a supporter of the cause, they're made because they are attached to the cause, whether they be for a company, for a organization, for a group, any of those things. So they are essentially distinct personal arguments. They're from someone's point of view and they're represented through them. They're the spokesperson, they're the mouthpiece for it. The fact-driven ones are ones which don't use I or we, and instead present bias through evidence and discussion. Now you can present bias through evidence and discussion. And it's actually very simple to do, because you actually would have done it before. But I'll explain that a bit later. Basically, presenting your bias through evidence and discussion means that you're presenting one side of the facts only, and you're using that as a tool of persuasion. As in, by presenting the right sorts of facts, you'll get people to respond in the way you want them to. So if you're thinking of an ad, for instance, then they won't always use a facts approach. But if they are to use the fact-based approach, then what they'll do is they'll give you all the reasons why using this product is great. It will suit you, it will help you immensely. And ignore all the drawbacks to it. So if it's for a new cleaning product, we'll say it'll make your tiles all gleaming and new. It doesn't mention the part about it taking hours and lots of legwork and scrub work. It just means that you get the first bit, which will actually happen, but will happen after a few hours. So it's about promoting the right sorts of facts and ignoring the facts which don't really support your argument. So, for instance, in a personal point of view, I've seen the effects of violence in our society and it cannot continue. Okay, a very personal approach, a very personal statement, and one which basically reflects an emotional perspective and someone's point of view. As in, it's someone, if it was me, I would basically be saying that I can tell you from experience that we cannot allow our society to continue as we are. If we're using the fact-based approach, 17% of those living in Western communities are at risk of violence or whatever it may be. Again, those two quotes can be saying exactly the same thing. Could be trying to persuade someone to support the exact same cause, and essentially they're completely different approaches. This one can be completely anonymous. I mean, it's using facts, it's using statistics. And those statistics are proven. They can't be disproved. Now, the personal response can use this, but it'll be more focusing on that sort of approach, whereas the more fact-driven approach will be more focusing on this sort of thing, providing statistics and evidence and presenting them in such a way where an argument's driven out of them. Okay, so that's what you'll be really looking for as a distinction between both of these approaches. Okay, so let's look at the personal approach first. Now, personal persuasive arguments often, as I said, attach a name, and this can include such texts as newspaper editorials and columns. So if you see basically a journalist who puts their name and often face together with an article, then it's clearly a persuasive argument based on their own point of view. Advertising, which again uses personal spokespeople, but it's also very direct, as in it's from us and we're trying to convince you of this. So it's from a group, an organization who are saying, we're quite clearly saying that this is an ad for this. Advocates and lobby groups, again, they're going to put their names to it. They're going to say it's a direct message from us. Speeches, as in if speaking in front of an audience is impossible to distance oneself from any comments that are being made during a speech. So speeches are personal. And when you're writing speeches, one thing to remember, and particularly if you're thinking, how do I write a speech? It's not an essay, because an essay is not you speaking, it's you reading. There's a difference. So speeches, because it's from you, you are the mouthpiece for the idea. It's yours. You can speak it in any way you choose, and you need to make it personal. And that's what really good speakers can do, is they don't just read a statement. They actually speak it, they perform it, they get other people to support it. And finally, politicians and political groups. Obviously, again, they support their own particular ideas, their own causes, their own groups. So again, anything that they say no matter what sort of facts are placed in it, are always their point of view or their party's point of view. Okay, let's look at it in terms of a fact-driven approach. Now, you actually are probably more familiar with this than what you think, because essentially it is an essay. An essay is a perfect example of the fact-driven persuasive argument, because what you're doing is you're trying to persuade your marker, first of all, that your answer is truthful and not just your opinion. And if you are writing essays effectively, you will know not to use I, we, or us. And the reason for that is this. When you submit an essay, and you'll particularly find this when you do your HSC, you don't have a name attached to it. You have a student number. And when you attach that, there's absolutely no idea about who is saying it. And so if you say something that's just your opinion and completely unsubstantiated by any form of truth or evidence, then essentially whoever's marking it's going to go, hang on, what are they saying? Who is saying this? I don't know who's saying this. I can't support it if you're not giving me a reason to. So while in speeches you can get away with making personal arguments without necessarily having to justify them, in the terms of an essay, you have to have justification for them because you're not there to be able to support it through your own words and through your own emotional responses. Now, if you're writing a speech, then yes, but you'll be writing it as you would perform it. Whereas in this case, if it's for an essay, you write it as an essay is, as in to provide a logical and academic analysis of ideas and facts. And the reason for that is because lots of people can read it and lots of people can take your ideas on board without necessarily having to be familiar with a certain idea that you have or even just your own emotional reaction to something. Okay. Now, other examples of this as well can include things like research papers and reports. Again, they are driven mostly by facts, but they can have an element of bias to them. And certainly, again, as I was saying before, with types of reporting of information, you can choose to basically present things how you wish to. Now, how does this work? Okay, well, we know the essay approach, but generally, how does persuasion work when you're presenting facts? Well, by presenting certain facts in a certain way, you can basically manipulate a reader. So you can essentially get them to accept information without having any sort of evidence that conflicts your point of view. So, for instance, research discussing the benefit of no cars on Australian roads would highlight only the proven benefits and ignore the problems. So if you were to say that the reason why there should be no cars on Australian roads is it's great for the environment, it's going to save a lot of money, it's going to be great for the dwindling oil reserves in the world, but of course the problems, people can't get anywhere, they can't go to work, they can't go to school, there'll be an overburden on public transport, there'll be a ton of arguments against this, and yet if you just focus on discussing all the four reasons, then it would seem like a very convincing argument that there should be never any cars on Australian roads. So, but again, that's that method of persuasion. If you balance it, your element of persuasion is lost. You're giving information, you're providing both sides of the coin. Whereas if you're providing only one side, you're being persuasive, you're trying to get people to support your point of view. And if you're to say that no cars should be on Australian roads and you give all these reasons why, even if, no matter how many facts you're using, you're giving your opinion, even if you're not using I, we, or us, and you are essentially presenting it in a bias/persuasive kind of way. All right, so an example of this. Well, let's look at this commercial here. Now, it's not important really that we look at this text as much as we just look at what the ad is doing. And it's a 2009 advertisement for Coca-Cola. I don't know if you've heard of this, you might have. And it was criticised for basically its use of unbalanced facts. Now, these facts are, in general cases, there were some things that were pulled out as being mistruths, but majority of it was truthful. However, it was quite unbalanced. It was using its own evidence to support its claim that the drink was not too bad for you. When, of course, you've been probably learning since childhood that you shouldn't always drink fizzy soft drinks because they can cause dental problems, health problems, weight problems, etc. And it pretty much ignores all the evidence to suggest all those things and really just focuses on the couple of things that it doesn't do, which dispelling some common myths that it thinks is important to dispel. And because it was criticised, because it ignored this extra information that disproved what it was trying to argue. As in, it disproved all the things that basically said, no, it's not too bad for you. And chooses to instead present some things to say that it's okay, it's not too bad. You shouldn't worry about it. If your kids are drinking it, then no problems at all. So again, it's how a persuasion and bias can be used in such a way that you can basically set a very strong message. And while this message in this case was very greatly undermined by the conflicting evidence, and certainly by those who were able to pick apart the message, if there weren't those people around, it would have still been a very convincing argument and still would have been presented in such a way that some people probably would have believed it. And that's the power of persuasion, is no matter how, valid an argument is, depending on the way you're looking at things, it can still be not only stated but supported with evidence and actually be presented in such a way that other people may believe it. And certainly if you're looking at using persuasive writing in your own ways, whether it's for debating, whether it's for essay writing or for arguments, you can basically set up your facts in order to promote your ideas. Alright, so in conclusion, persuasion is basically shown through your representation and through your argument. So make sure you remember that those two things are essentially what drives your persuasion in your writing. It can be personal, and certainly there's nothing wrong with the personal approach, and it's used by a certain number of texts, as is the fact-driven approach. And really the main thing that you should be looking at first of all is looking at those two approaches, looking at, the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, and looking at the forms which use those approaches to sort of, decide how different forms of persuasion, and be able to work out for yourself what forms of persuasion can be used and how effective they can be. And that's basically it for understanding persuasion. So until next time, I'll see you later.